Hello, and a very warm welcome to Sapporo Gakuen University Community College Global Issues in English. And today's topic is climate change. Before we begin, I would like you to visit this page where you can find some vocabulary support and some language exercises which will help you with the topic. And today's topic is climate change, sometimes called global warming. The Earth is absolutely getting warmer. We can see this in any number of graphs, this one from the 1880s, showing very clearly a rise in global average temperatures. We can see this also over a longer period of time. This is from 500 years ago, and we get a very dramatic jump in temperatures in the 20th century. Here we can also see that the temperature is going up again in the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century. The bottom graph shows land temperatures, the center graph shows ocean temperatures, and the top graph shows land and ocean temperatures, all showing very dramatic increases year by year. In fact, 2019 was the second warmest year on record. 2010 to 2019 was the warmest decade on record. Temperature records are being broken around the world. From 26,000 weather stations around the world, we find 42,487 daily high temperature records. So records are being broken. Newspapers around the world are becoming very excited. In each country, we find very, very hot temperatures and very uncomfortable temperatures. In Japan too, we see very hot summers, very uncomfortable weather, particularly in the large cities. Why is this happening? Well, the answer is the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect, as we can see in this diagram, is more and more gases are being trapped in the Earth's atmosphere and they cannot escape. Which gases make up the greenhouse effect? There are three main greenhouse gases from human activity. These are carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, or methane, both pronunciations are okay, and nitrous oxide. In this talk I will be talking about carbon dioxide and methane. I will not be talking about nitrous oxide, which comes mostly from farming. Okay, and carbon dioxide, as we can see in this pie chart, makes up 65% of the greenhouse gases that come from fossil fuel, which is coal and oil and gas. Carbon dioxide also has 11% of greenhouse gases from forests, cutting down forests, and from farming. So together, carbon dioxide makes up 76% of greenhouse gases. Methane makes up 16% of greenhouse gases. All right, carbon dioxide, where does it come from? The answer is 33% comes from electricity. 20% comes from factories, 17% comes from transport, which is cars and buses and planes and ships, 13% comes from farming and cutting down trees, and 7% comes from our houses and our heating. And how much carbon dioxide are we emitting? Well, again, we can see from thousands and thousands of years ago, we have this very dramatic jump in the second half of the 20th century. And if you remember, we looked at a temperature chart at the beginning of the talk, and we can look at the 20th century and we can see a very similar pattern between the two graphs, a very big jump in temperature and a very big jump in CO2. Now in Hawaii, at the Mauna Loa Observatory at the top of the volcano, they have been measuring CO2 in the atmosphere since the 1960s, and again we can see a very clear rise in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Scientists suppose that around 350 parts per million is the safe zone, and anything above that is becoming dangerous. And as you can see from about 1995, the parts per million CO2 concentrations passed that number, and they are now about 412, 413 parts per million, which is considered a danger zone. All right, now how much CO2 do countries emit? Each country, we can see that China is the largest emitter of CO2 with 28% of CO2 emissions in the world. The United States is second with 14. India is next, then comes Russia, and then comes Japan. So Japan is number 6 in the world, so a rather high number. However, we also need to think of how much CO2 does every person produce in 1 year. So for example, in Japan, how much CO2 does each Japanese person produce in 1 year? Do you think it's about 3.7 tons? Do you think it's about 6.8 tons? Do you think it's about 8.9 tons? The answer, surprisingly, is 8.9 tons. This graph may be a little bit difficult to see, but you can see Japan is number 7 behind Australia, Canada, the United States, South Korea, and Russia. In fact, Japan, or Japanese people, produce more each of CO2 than China, which produces 6.5 tons per person. Now, moving away from carbon dioxide, let's think and where it comes from. And again, if we look at the red on the left, that's 24% of methane comes from oil and gas. And then on the lower right, the light green, the 9%, that comes from coal mining. So if we put those together, we get 33% of methane coming from fossil fuels. Again, oil, coal, and gas. On the lower left side, we have 7% from rice farming, and then the grey is from garbage, and the dark green on the right is from cows, which is rather a surprise. So I want to think about the rice farming for a moment, the light brown on the lower left. When farmers put water onto their rice fields in the spring, sometimes you can see bubbles coming up from the bottom. That is methane. Now in Japan, farming technology has improved a lot and they're cutting down on the methane emissions, which is very good news. But in other countries, there's still quite a lot of bubbling methane coming to the surface every spring. And cows. Now cows are rather mysterious. Why are cows producing methane? And the answer is when cows eat grass, they have a very interesting stomach structure, and they burp, which means coming out of their mouth, they produce methane gas. And how much methane gas does a cow produce? Here's a quiz. How much methane can a cow produce in 1 day? A, between 80 and 140 litres a day. B, between 140 and 250 litres a day. C, between 250 and 500 litres a day. And a bonus question for you. How many cows are there in the world? Do you think there are 1.8 million? Do you think there are 740 million? Do you think there are 1.5 billion? The answers are there are about 1.5 billion cows in the world, and one cow can produce between 250 and 500 litres of methane every day. So if you think of a 1 litre bottle of water and imagine 500 of those every day being filled with methane from a cow that is burping. And in total, this is 3.1 gigatons of methane every year. So a very large amount of methane coming from cows. Some results of climate change. We get very extreme weather events, which I'm sure you're familiar with, these huge hurricanes and typhoons, very active around the world, doing a lot of damage. We also have droughts, periods where there's no rain for a very long time, and floods, again very familiar in Japan. And the floods, of course, cause crop damage, which affects our food supplies, and then wildfires, causing a huge amount of damage. Now this year, especially in California and Oregon, in Siberia, and very importantly also in Brazil, in the Amazon area and other areas of Brazil, again, the burning of the forests produces even more CO2, very, very serious situation. The global warming is also causing animals to become endangered. They cannot find food. Also melting ice, which is causing the sea levels to rise. These are topics that I will talk about in other talks. We don't have time today, but also very, very serious effects of climate change. And we have to think about the costs. In Japan, for example, in 2015, in the Kanto and Tohoku area, 52 billion yen's worth of damage. In 2018, in West Japan, 200 billion yen's worth of damage. And then we have to think about 2020, how much damage that was, and next year and the year after. These problems are not going to go away. These are things that we will have to expect year after year after year. And of course there is the human cost. People may lose their homes, they may lose their jobs, and most tragically, of course, they may lose their lives. So we have a very, very serious situation. And how are we doing per capita producing CO2 and greenhouse gases? The answer is, I'm afraid, not very well. You can see the black line at the bottom is the world average emissions, and they are not changing very much. They are not going down. And what must we do soon is we must cut the emissions, especially these blue emissions at the bottom, which are CO2. The darker blue is from fossil fuels, from coal and oil and gas. The lighter blue is from farming. And then the green, the dark green and the light green, the methane, these are areas that must really be cut as soon as possible. According to scientists, 2 degrees centigrade is the danger zone for temperature increase. And if we don't want the Earth's temperature to increase by more than 2 degrees centigrade, we must do these following things. Global greenhouse gas emissions must fall by 7.6% each year from 2020. Coal production, especially, must be cut by 13% every year for the next 10 years. We must cut all our emissions by 50% from 2015 levels by 2030. And we must cut all our emissions from 2010 levels by 66% by 2050. And we must reach zero emissions as soon as possible. And how are we doing? Again, not very well. When we look at global CO2 emissions, they're continuing to rise. They're going up and up. We are not making much difference. And we have here some scenarios that might happen. We are on this dotted green line, and you can see if we continue on the orange line, we are going to reach 4.9 degrees warming, and human beings will have a very difficult time to survive at those temperatures. If we follow the green line, there will be a 3 degrees temperature warming, and again we will have very, very serious consequences. We must follow the yellow line, and if possible follow the blue line, and then we can perhaps escape from the worst consequences of climate change and global warming. If we do not do this, then I'm afraid I am going to be a very worried man, and in fact my face will look like the face of this very young child, and I will not be a happy man. Thank you for watching. See you again.